My name is Morgan Young. I'm interviewing Metsger for the Oregon State Capitol Foundation Oral History Project. It is April 30th, 2025, and we are in Salem, Oregon. Thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Oh, it's great to be here.
I want to start with the beginning. So tell me a little bit about your early life in Sandy and then in Gresham.
Well, I grew up in Sandy, and it was about population 800 there, nothing like it is now. My grandparents had a berry farm in Sandy, and after the war they moved up from California and started the berry farm, and then my mom and dad moved up with them. My father was in the U.S. Marine Corps, serving in the South Pacific in World War II. Met my mom on leave in Southern California, and they got married. And then when the grand folks decided to just have a different life after the war and come on up to Oregon to start a berry farm, they came with them. So I was born in 1951, so a few years after they got there. It was a great little town. My dad was the postmaster there. Spent a lot of time playing in the back office of the post office all the time. Got involved in stamp collecting then because of that, and it was, just a wonderful time. I mean, as you know, with most kids, we did a lot of fishing. My dad and I spent lots of time on the berry farm. I remember the first few years I had to be lectured by my grandma that I wasn't supposed to pick the green ones. But I finally learned to pick the red ones. And then moved to Gresham when I was about 11. Moved into the Rockwood neighborhood, far east Multnomah County. Went to Rockwood grade school and then to Centennial High School.
And then you went to Lewis and Clark, right?
Went to Lewis and Clark. It was, I'd gone there because in high school I was active in speech and debate. And they had a great debate there. Someone I debated with in high school by the name of Earl Blumenauer had gone on to Lewis and Clark. I thought, well, that was a good place to go. So went on to Lewis and Clark after that, and got my bachelor's there, and later came back and got my master's there. And at the same time started coaching as the assistant basketball coach for Lewis and Clark for a few years during the time I was getting my master's degree. So spent a lot of time on Palatine Hill Road.
And after school or after undergrad, you've had a lot of careers.
I remember one time at Thanksgiving when I was doing sportscasting at the time, and I could only be there for a while. I had to leave like around 2 o'clock, just before everybody was going to sit down for dinner. And I remember my grandmother leaning over to my mom saying, "Don't worry, dear, someday he'll get a real job." So I did. I started out teaching. I taught at Barlow High School and also in the what's called Gresham Barlow School District now, but it's Gresham Barlow Centennial at the time. And I taught speech and ran the media center, library and all that kind of stuff for a few years. And at the same time then, during that same time simultaneously, I was coaching basketball at Lewis and Clark, so I would leave in the afternoon to go back to Palatine Hill, coach basketball, and really enjoyed that. But teaching wasn't really what I wanted to do. I thought I did, but I think like a lot of folks that get into their first career, it's not exactly what they envisioned. I mean, for me, it was, being really active in student council and speech and debate and history and all that stuff. I kind of came in with the expectation that all my students would be just as excited. So it was kind of a letdown when, a lot of them didn't have that same enthusiasm. So I really enjoyed the basketball part and working with, young people doing that. But I did that for about 3.5 years. I remember when I left teaching, I had just got my tenure, where you can't be fired, right? And that's right then when I was going to leave. I said, I don't want to be locked in. I want to try something else, and wasn't afraid to do that, and that happened.
Is that when you decided to go back to Lewis and Clark?
No, I had just finished my master's, but I was still coaching basketball at Lewis and Clark.
Okay.
But that is when it happened. When I was coaching basketball, my second year, I was recruiting a young man named Kevin Bryant, who went to Sunset High School for our basketball team. Well, I was unsuccessful, got really close. He ended up going to Western Washington and became an all-star there. So I had the right guy. And remember going to his home, meeting his parents, had a great time. We talked about teaching and coaching and all that. And so about a year later, the year I left Barlow, the following year, I was at practice at Lewis and Clark, and Dean Sempert, who was the head coach, after practice that day, said, "You got a message to call at Ted Bryant." And I couldn't figure out who Ted Bryant was. And then I realized he was the father of Kevin Bryant, who I had recruited the year before. Well, Ted also happened to be the news director at KOIN TV. So I called Ted and he said, "Hey, remember me, Ted Bryant, news director at KOIN?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, Ted Dawson, our sports guy, just went to work for CBS LA, and we've just hired Brian Dries out of Chicago as our new sports guy. But he says he wants to expand the department. He needs a sports reporter and someone to do the weekend sports, and wanted to know if you'd be interested in auditioning for that." I said, "What?" So I figured, well, what's the worst that could happen? I don't get the job and I just stay doing what I'm doing, right? So a few of my players and I went down to KOIN a few days later and I did an audition. Still have that tape. I was terrible. But I guess I was better than the other people, and I got offered the job to be the weekend sports and backup main sports anchor at KOIN. And I joined in February 11th, 1977.
Good year.
It was a good year. And it happened, of course, turned out to be the year the Blazers would go on to win the NBA championship. So within a month, I'm going to Chicago. I'm going to Los Angeles. I'm going to Denver. I say, what a life! Win the championship. Like, oh, every year this is going to be great. Of course, I haven't won in 50 years since, but it was a great way to start out. Yeah.
And we were chatting before that you also were covering the Timbers in their early years.
Yeah, we were the television partner for the Portland Timbers in their original rendition. I did the play-by-play for the Timbers. Refused to say nil. I always said 0. And you mentioned Mick Hoban, always say it's nil. It's 0. We're in the United States. But that was a lot of fun, and got to do a lot of different broadcasting. Did the Davis Cup when they came with Jimmy Connors and Chris Evert. Did a lot of racing. Went to the Indianapolis 500. And of course, the NBA, on and on. One of the real fun things I did, or it started a lifetime friendship, was got to know Bill Walton early, and he was a difficult one to get to know. But we kind of formed this relationship, and then we all know what happened with Bill, and he left and went on to Boston, had injuries and everything else. And in the late 1980s, the Blazers started getting good again with Clyde Drexler, Buck Williams, Jerome Kersey, and making the NBA Finals against the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. And we were going to be, KOIN was carrying the NBA games. And so the management wanted to do a post-game show for each of the playoff games. But we needed a color guy. And I suggested, why don't we see if we can get Bill Walton? And I called Bill. Bill agreed to do it. And it was the first time he had done television. And he wrote about it in his little book. It kind of gave him his start in TV. And he was great. Here was a guy who couldn't talk, publicly, in 1977. And as you all know, and anybody knows Bill Walton, he'd go on for hours. And he was sensational. And it was just great working with him. We called it the Blazer Trail, and it was the post-game show. It was a great time, TV back in those days, because there was no cable TV. CNN had just started, and it was pretty much, pretty basic level. There was no live sports. So your photographers and your sports folks, and same thing for news, if you didn't go out and do it yourself, it didn't get covered. And so all the, whether it's an Oregon State game, an Oregon game, the Lake Oswego High School. We covered it all ourselves with our own crews, and which is, so much now you don't see a lot of local sports. It's things come off over the the cable TV and stuff, but we did that, and you got things that you never would ever get on cable TV when you're actually there, doing it in person, getting to know people, and doing real stories. It was kind of called the halcyon days of television.
Did this background in sportscasting and then your background from speech, did that help when you became an elected official, of being able to speak?
Oh, it really did. It really did. I always think that everybody is always, I always say, everybody is an advocate. Everybody. In your own home, you've got kids and they're advocating mom and dad to do this, you're advocating to do something else. Any kind of a workplace, you're advocating for different things. And being able to convey that in a way that was understandable and convincing. So it was extremely helpful in making that transition and being comfortable being an advocate for whatever the issue might be.
And then where does the credit union experience come in? Because that's another career avenue you had.
So when I left Channel 6 in 1992, I was a member of Portland Teachers Credit Union. It's now called On Point Community Credit Union. But I'd been a member since I was a teacher, so I had been a member for 18 years. Back in those days in television, we had this kind of hard line that you couldn't participate in other things, to compromise journalistic integrity. So there was a pretty good line there. But once I left TV, I said, I got to get involved with some other things. And so one of the things I did was I ran for the board of the credit union, and I was elected to that position. And I was serving with the credit union at the time that a bill came up in the Oregon legislature in 1997, and that was to allow credit unions to expand their field of membership. Up until that point, a credit union could only serve the members of their employer group. So if Portland teachers, they could only serve teachers. If you were Tektronix credit union, you could only serve employees of Tektronix. So it kind of limited their ability to expand and provide new services, et cetera. Well, of course, the banks hated that. They didn't want credit unions to expand. They wanted people to go to the banking. So there was a bill in the legislature in 1997 that would allow them to expand. The federal government had just passed, for federal credit unions, that act the year before. But the president of the Senate was Brady Adams. Brady Adams was the chairman of a bank, and there was just no way this was going to happen. So we had the bill. I was asked by Pam Leavitt, who was the lobbyist and still is for Oregon's credit unions, if I would come and give citizen testimony as a board member about why this would be important. So I came to the legislature, my first time testifying, and I was in the Senate Business Committee. It was chaired by Senator Ken Baker, lived in my district. And we had plenty of votes on the floor, we knew that, but he wasn't going to let out of his committee, kind of the chain of command between Brady Adams and Senator Baker. And I just couldn't believe it. How could you have so much support and you can't even get a vote to get it out of committee? And that's what happened. Afterwards, Pam said, why don't you run for the legislature? That guy that killed our bill is the same district you live in. And so why would I want to do that? And I said, that's a lot of work and a lot of time. Oh, it's easy. It's not that difficult at all. Boy, do I remind her of that. But I did. I decided to run. I was a volunteer candidate. I was a Democrat. Democrats didn't have a candidate. They didn't think they would win that seat. It was held by a Republican and incumbent. And
so walk me through, what does it mean to be a volunteer candidate?
Well, I just filed. And then, Kate Brown called, who was a Democratic leader, and said, oh, hi, I'm Kate Brown, and you're running for this office. Yeah, I am. And, of course, asking for support and got a lot of courtesy. Well, we'll see what we can do. I mean, they didn't think they would be able to win the seat, so I had to prove it. So I went out and raised a lot of money myself. And as I started raising that money and they started doing polling and seeing that had a chance to win, then they started getting behind me then. And you know, I won the primary and I won the general election. And in January of 1989, I came to the Senate with Peter Courtney and Lee Beyer. And it was fascinating coming in because when I'm running for the Senate, it's totally controlled by the Republicans in the House and the Senate, okay? There's 20 Republicans and only 10 Democrats. I mean, it was quorum proof. Democrats didn't need to show up to even have the meeting, right? And it was actually 22-8 because two of the Democrats, May Yee and Thomas Wilde, were pretty much Republicans, right? So when the three of us came in, it immediately changed from 2010 to 17-13, and it started the movement for Democratic control.
What is it like being a freshman legislature? I mean, that first day, I would be very intimidated to go to the state.
It was just kind of like, you know, a kid in a candy store. You're kind of everything's awe, you know, and like, you know, do I really belong here with all these people? So it was a fast learning process. But I spent my time learning right away, you know, how it worked. I got my copy of Mason's manual, which is still in I said, I'm going to know parliamentary procedure like nobody in this building. I said, you know, because to me, I use my sports mentality. This is a game, and I need to know how to make the plays and execute to be successful. And I had some good mentors there in my first year in the Senate, which were very, very helpful. And I just kind of put my nose to the grindstone and figured I'm going to figure out how this place works. And just like in, you know, most everything else, it's like, you know, it's building relationships. And so you know, I went about building relationships because I know that's how things get done.
I want you to tell me about your first desk in the Senate chamber, and there was a special connection you had to it.
Yeah, so there was a few desks available. It's based on seniority, but three of us came in, and so there was a number of, you know, choices. I ended up picking the second desk on the second row because if you look on the side of the desk in the Senate, every senator who's ever had that desk has a bronze plaque on the side of the desk. And Vic Atiyeh had that desk. And through a marital relationship, Vic was, you know, part of the family. And so I thought to honor him, in fact, his grandson, Kevin, and I'm his godfather, I selected that desk and had that for the first 4 years. And then after Cliff Troe retired from the Senate, he had the desk in front of me. I then moved into the front of the chamber.
So tell me a little bit about the district in which you were representing.
Yeah, that was one of the most fascinating things. When I came in 1999, my district went from just over the Cascade Mountains at Mount Hood all the way through the city of Canby. So, you know, all down the mountain through Clackamas County, Estacada, Clackamas, Oregon City, and Wilsonville to Canby. On the far east of my district, I butted up against Ted Ferrioli, who was the Republican leader of the Senate. On the west side, I went all the way up to 82nd Avenue and Johnson Creek Road, where I butted the district of Kate Brown, the Democratic leader. So, needless to say, I had the most diverse district in the Senate. I had extremely conservative parts of my district. One of my two representatives was Lynn Snodgrass, who was the Republican Speaker of the House at the time. I also had very Democratic area around the city of Portland and on the suburbs of Oregon City. Very agricultural based in many ways. And so the electorate was all over the map. And I think one of the reasons I was successful winning that and holding that seat was because you really had to listen to everybody. There was not one constituency there. And I think that made me a better senator, you know, being able to really be involved with all the different people in that district and listen to them and understood what they were going through and what they needed.
What were some of the interests that you were aware of in 1999?
Well, certainly the agricultural area. I represented Estacada and Sandy. Historically, there was a lot of logging families there. This was the spotted owl had happened already. They were losing jobs. They had been very strongly Democratic. They were starting to move away from that because they didn't feel the state was recognizing, their plight and their lifestyle. So some of the biggest nursery places in the state were in my district. And so I became kind of a Democratic champion in my caucus for agricultural issues. And then, my own basic, conviction of social issues was a place where I felt it needed a voice because the way the demographic was, it was not necessarily strong there. So I figured I could have that support because of my other work in that area. So, I took on things that transparency in government was a big thing for me. Trying to open it up to the public, providing a voice in the Democratic caucus for agricultural issues. And I think that, and the fact that I had a history, I grew up in that district. Like I say, my father was a postmaster there. I had been on TV, so a lot of people knew who I was. Whether they liked me or not, they really knew who I was. And so I think there was a comfort zone, that I wasn't just another career politician. I was 46 years old when I got elected. I'd already had 2 careers. So I think we connected well, the electorate and myself, and I just really enjoyed that.
So when you're a freshman senator, the leadership in your party, are they selecting which committees you serve on, or?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
And you make your requests, what committees you want to be on, and then it goes from there. Now, in this case, the Republicans controlled the Senate my first 4 years, so the ultimate decision was made by the leadership on the Republican Party. But my requests were honored. I wanted to be on business and transportation and natural resources, because those were areas that were really important to my district, and I got all of those. And so they were very, very respectful of that. I learned a lot. As I say, we had some good mentors in there. And I learned a lot about being in the minority party, by the way, and which was very helpful later on.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a bit, because it switched
Yes.
during your time in the Senate, and I think it's an interesting perspective I would like to hear from you of what it's like to be in the minority party versus the majority party.
Yeah. One of the things, this is 2025, we're doing this, and Democrats have controlled the House and the Senate for a long time in Oregon. Almost all, with the exception, I think, of only 2 people here in 2025, all those legislators have never served, Democrats have never served in the minority. They don't know what that's like. Serving in the minority, I learned a lot of things I'll never do for, again, the majority. I thought it was wrong. I thought it hurt the process. But at the same standpoint, I learned some good things from some of those. Neil Bryant, Republican out of Bend, for example. Vern Duncan, Republican out of Milwaukee. What's the right way to do things? And I learned being in the minority party of being basically suppressed as well as being embraced. And I said, well, I'm going to take the embraced, because the people who embraced good ideas, whether they're from your party or the other party, they end up being most successful in the process. There's a lot of loud voices in politics. Loud voices usually don't get things done. It's the people that don't talk a lot that get stuff done, and they work together collaboratively. So when we did take the majority, a few years later, I made a point of remembering how I didn't want to be treated. And so I worked really, really hard on that. I stayed in transportation the entire time. In 2003, when we tied the Senate 15-15, I became the chair of the Business and Transportation Committee. And 2 years later, in 20, in 205, I don't know what I said, it was 2003, but in 2005, we took the majority at that point. And again, I was chairman of transportation. So Bruce Starr came over from the House. He was the Republican chair of transportation the year before in the House. He came in and joined my committee as a vice chair. So one of the first things I did was something that was not done at the time that I thought was important. And that is, when you have the committee and you have your agenda and you have all your bills, you meet once a week, usually with your administrator, decide what bills you're going to hear, what you're going to do, and then you just tell everybody else this is what we're doing. I never liked that. I didn't want them controlling the agenda totally. So I told Bruce, I said, you may be my co-chair, my vice chair, but as far as I'm concerned, you're going to be my co-chair. So I brought him in the meeting with the administrator every week, and together we decided which bills we were going to work.
Yeah, so tell me a bit about, so you had experience working in the minority party, and then you become the majority party, and what was it like when you were co-chair and chair, and how were you working with your Republican colleagues?
Well, I took what I learned in the minority party to keep my promise to myself that I was not going to duplicate some of the experiences I had as a member of the minority. And so one of the things I did, which was unheard of at the time, is Bruce Starr came into the Senate. He was a Republican, had been serving in the House, and was really good on transportation. And he was named the vice chair. And I brought him in my office. I said, Bruce, you're going to be, as far as I'm concerned, co-chair. You're going to meet with the administrator with me every week as we put together these bills. We're going to decide together which bills we're going to work. We're going to find the bills that there's just no way that either you or I could ever agree on and put them aside. And then we're going to take the other bills that we both have some concerns about one way or the other, but agree to work on and see if we can come up with a resolution. And that worked very, very well. The House of Representatives was still strongly Republican. I knew that I could move stuff out of my Senate committee, probably pass it on the Senate floor, but I would never get it out of the House if there was any controversy by any members of the Republican Party. And my goal was not to move stuff out of the Senate. My stuff was to get stuff passed and signed into law. So it worked very, very well. I can't think of a bill that we didn't pass out of the Senate that didn't pass the House of Representatives and get signed by the governor, because I needed Republican ambassadors from my committee to help sell our legislation on the other side of the building in the House, because it was Republican. So we had to work together, and it worked very, very well. And the end result was that we passed the most significant transportation packages in the history of the state at that time. We started the Oregon Transportation Investment Act, which was known as OTIA 1, OTIA 2, OTIA 3, and then finally the Jobs and Transportation Act in 2009, which was by far the biggest transportation bill that had ever been passed in the legislature. It came on the heels of the 2008 recession. We wanted to get people back to work, and they all involve raising taxes, but we got them done.
What was the first bill that you remember getting signed by the governor that you were involved in?
Yeah, and I have a picture of that. It was a bill on, kind of a nothing bill about clarifying rules for garnishment of wages. So, and it came through my committee, and it was the first bill out of the Senate. And there was a tradition in the Senate at the time that when you're a freshman legislator and you carry your first bill, they're going to haze you. So I carried this bill on garnishment, and one by one, members of the Senate would get up and ask a question of the carrier. What is the appropriate garnishment for a vodka tonic? Is that covered in this bill? And they would do all kinds of things around the word garnish, trying to, kind of fluster me a little bit. So we had a great little sparring time on that. It was a lot of fun. But so it was really a nothing bill, but it was my indoctrination into the Senate.
I want to talk a bit. Well, let's talk about your sense of humor, because this is a good segue into that. And I think you became known for your sense of humor, and you showed me some satirical publications that you made.
Yeah.
How did that serve you during your time in the legislature?
Well, like I said, I was a journalist, and there's a lot of tensions in the legislature, especially as the session goes on. And I've always believed that, I think in any line of work, you take your work seriously, but you don't take yourself so seriously. Otherwise, you just get bogged down mentally on everything else. And so I thought we needed a little lighthearted approach to things. So I started a publication called The Weekly, W-E-A-K-L-E-Y, because we were in the minority, The Weekly Democrat. The subtitle was, if it's news to us. And I would just do satire. I would take different bills, different things that were said on the floor. I would kind of take liberty with how they actually put together, and would write these various stories about using actual quotes and things to put a narrative together. It wasn't totally accurate, but it was kind of funny. And I would do that, and then I would distribute those to all the legislators in the House and the Senate. And they just ate it up. They just thought that was funny. I mean, there's video you can see of me or my staff bringing things into the floor for a new edition. And these bills would be talked about in the House or the Senate, but all these people were reading the Weekly Democrat instead of paying attention to the bill on the floor. And so it was quite a hit, and had a lot of fun with that. After we became the majority, I changed the title to the Not So Weekly Democrat. But it was very ecumenical. Republicans and Democrats alike, nobody was safe, including the author. Made a lot of fun about myself on some of these bills. But it was just a way to bring some levity to what we were doing at the time, and because the work was very important. But sometimes you just need a little break and step back and say, yeah, that was kind of a turkey bill, wasn't it? And I remember one in particular, Senator Jenny Burdick. Senator Burdick had a bill that she was moving through the legislature, where if you walked out into the street, it wasn't a crosswalk. If you walked down the street and held your hand up, then the cars had to stop. I'm thinking, Jenny, this is crazy. You're just going to get run over. People aren't going to care about that. And so I wrote a story for the Weekly Democrat, and I got my staff out, and we simulated a sequence of pictures, with you going out and holding the hand up. Here comes the car. The next time the car is right there, and the next thing the car's by, and then there's this body laying on the floor of the street with their hand in the air, and just pretty well ridiculing this bill is the craziest thing I ever heard. Well, everybody laughed that up, except Jenny, because it killed her bill. And she will say, if you ever talk to Jenny, she said, Rick killed my bill. That Weekly Democrat, people laughed, and there was no way they were going to vote for that bill. I said, oh, well, it wasn't my intent, but power of the press.
Tell me a bit about your staff. How many folks were working for you? And
Oh, I love my staff. It's probably one of the proudest moments serving the legislature, and I'm sure a lot of other legislators would say the same thing. Had 2 staff every year. I never carried anybody over more than one time, so 2 sessions. Kick them out of the nest and go do something great. And they all have. And I keep tabs with almost all of them. They're all doing sensational. Right now, I'm working as a quasi-lobbyist, mostly a public affairs writer, but a little lobbying for Ryan Tribbett, who owns PacWest. Ryan, I brought in fresh, wet behind the ears out of college to be a legislative aide to me 27 years ago. And now I work for him, so that's kind of interesting. But I've had a staffer who's went on, works in D.C. and has gone internationally and worked with underdeveloped countries, writing their constitutions. I have the chief counsel working at TriMet now, a law professor at Lewis and Clark College, Leanne Donaldson, who a year ago was the head of the Oregon State Bar. I'm proud of all of them, and that really is probably one of the most proud things. It's just watching these people grow and take their own world.
Are the majority of legislative aides, are they younger people fresh in their careers or early in their careers?
At the time, it was a combination of things. They were either very young or they were older family members. I never employed any family members. I just didn't think that was right, but you can do that in the Senate. And so a lot of, and the House, a lot of folks would bring their spouse, especially those, and I can understand this, Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, their way, and that was the way for them to be together, so their wife or their husband would be, one of their legislative aides. But for the most part, the others were usually younger, kind of their first stab at the legislature and understanding where they wanted to go with their career.
So that leads nicely to another question I had, was just a little bit of the logistics of being a senator. You lived hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes away from the Capitol.
Right.
And were you initially trying to commute every day, or did you move to Salem?
What I did was, which was a lot of folks that were that far away, rented a place in Salem during the week, go home on weekends. So where we are now on Court Street, the historic neighborhood, just 2 blocks up in the neighborhood, I rented a home along with Senator Frank Shields, Senator Avil Gordley, and Senator Ginny Burdick. All 4 of us lived together. It was...
It's like a plot for a sitcom.
It really was. In fact, it really was a sitcom at times. And so the first 2 sessions of the legislature, we all lived together there. And we could just walk to the Capitol, and it was great. And then a couple years later, I found this house that we're in now, in the same neighborhood, and I bought the house. And then my last 4 years, I did the same thing. I lived here during session, go home to Mount Hood on the weekends.
And when you're in Salem in the week and the legislature is in session, do you have a regular schedule? Are you at the Capitol at like 9 a.m. and you're trying to leave at 5?
Yeah, pretty much. A number of sessions I had 8 o'clock committees, so I'd be there at 7:30 or so. I had a lot of committees at 3 o'clock that went to 5 o'clock. So it was pretty much a 7:30 to 5:30 day. Very, very busy. They are now as well. Once you get in the building, you're pretty well locked in because most people serve on at least 3 committees. Some people served on 4, and in between that time, you're meeting with constituents and members of the lobby, so very little downtime during the day. And it wears on you after a while.
Yeah, when we were chatting earlier, you had mentioned that it's now end of April and it's been in session since January. I imagine people are pretty tired.
People get a little grumpy at the end of session. They're exhausted. Bills now are coming very, very fast. There's deadlines to move stuff. A lot of stuff doesn't get the scrutiny it should. That's been a problem in the legislature for quite a while. I'm not sure what to do about that because you're just trying to get the workload through. But people get a little grumpy. Everybody's all over them, all their constituents, all the lobby, all their fellow legislators who are lobbying them on their bills. It's a very heavy load that people have to have. And you have to really be very careful how you interact with folks because they are under a lot of stress, and kind of give them some grace, if you're trying to get things moved through, because there's just so many balls they're all trying to juggle right now.
Well, and I think too we have a citizen legislature, and so people are also having to balance having another job
right.
while they're in the public sector,
right,
in public service.
Yeah, and that's very difficult to do.
Tell me a bit about serving as the president pro temp of the Senate.
Yeah, I never wanted to be in leadership because I always felt, especially with my district, I wanted to be a free agent. I didn't want to feel I had to be obligated for anything with the caucus if I felt it conflicted with my district. But at the end, Peter was talking to me, and I'd already said I wasn't going to be coming back after that term. He talked about becoming his pro tem. I thought, well, that would be a right time to do that. And so I ran for that. Ginny Burdick was also interested in that position. She was very kind to defer to me. She would be continuing on in the Senate, but I was going to leave. So I got elected pro tem, and it was great. I really enjoyed that, working with Peter on a regular basis all the time. And I also appreciated the fact that he had a lot of confidence in me that he could do things away from the chamber. So I ran most of the sessions when I was pro tem rather than Peter. And so he could do all the things that the president has to do. So I got to run the session many, many times. Always took great pride in running a clean session. It's where my Mason's legislative manual of knowing parliamentary procedure came in very, very handy. And that was a really great experience.
Is there anything else you want to tell me about your committee work? I mean, talked a little bit about transportation, but anything specific for the serving in the committees?
Transportation, of course, was a big key. We did a lot of things in the business committee. We took on a lot of very tough issues, and some were very controversial. I didn't mind controversial issues. I thought that was good. I remember taking a lot of bullets, working on Safe Corporation in the early 2000s, which was under fire for a number of its practices. Another senator at the time, Vicki Walker, was the one who was instrumental in exposing some of those things. We took that on in the business committee. Safe was something that everybody had an involvement in, and didn't appreciate that we were calling them into question. That was the State Workers' Compensation Board. And I took a lot of political hits for that. We didn't end up passing any legislation, but we had hearings on it, and really exposing some of the things that were not being done absolutely correctly for workers and for even the employers who were paying those fees. And about a year later, or less than a year later, the head of Safe had stepped down. Kulongoski fired the board, and I give Senator Walker tremendous credit for exposing that in the first place. But at the time, it was, don't go there, but it was really important. Senator Walker and I then teamed up the next year on another very controversial bill, and that was, we felt PG was overcharging ratepayers. And that was extremely, the lobby of the utilities is very strong. We took that on. We were successful. I think PG ratepayers got a $300 million rebate the next couple of years because of that legislation. But you feel the bumps and bruises from all the political lobby. Political lobby are the ones that support your campaigns. It's really tough to do. But when you succeed at it and it's the right thing, and it's then recognized as the right thing once you're done, you feel pretty good about it.
Talk to me about your involvement on the Capitol grounds. There were several things that you championed.
I love the state capitol, and it's the people's place. And I always remember going back to D.C. when I was in high school and just being in awe of the Capitol Mall and all the museums and everything. And so I wanted to do some things to kind of elevate that. And so it started in 2007. Senator Jason Atkinson, who was a Republican senator from Jacksonville, had a tremendous passion for the Capitol. I mean, he would always talk about the Capitol. He would do remonstrances on the floor about how the railings, the brass railings, hadn't been polished in a long time, and that there was cobwebs here. And he did a video tour that he put online to show people about how bad this was, and we weren't keeping it up. So he introduced a bill that would change the money to maintain the Capitol from the Department of Administrative Services to the Parks Department, because he felt DAS, they always penciled that in at the very last thing and underfunded it. So he wanted to do that. So we had committee meetings about that. And it was interesting. So DAS, of course, opposed that. But he really wanted to do that. And I thought it made a lot of sense to me. But then we were talking about what would it be? Would it be the Capitol? And he wanted to do the immediate Capitol grounds between State Street and Court Street. And as we were having this discussion in committee, and I had the opportunity, thanks for Olis, to actually go back and listen to the whole committee hearing at that time in 2007. As we were discussing, I said, the Capitol is everything. It's the grounds. It's across the street, the fountain. It's the Capitol, the mall. I said, we've all been to the National Mall. It's a national, a national park. I said, we should make the whole Capitol grounds a state park. Not just, let's don't go halfway. Let's turn the whole thing over to the Parks Department and make it a Capitol Park. And Jason, sitting on the dais with me, he goes, yeah. Courtney's just, who's on the committee, is just putting his head in, oh no, what are we doing now? So we had this discussion about it. Courtney thought that was going a little too far. We said, no, this is the people's place. Let's do this. And Jason and I, well, we were two of the 5 people on the committee, and I think we could have had a couple other votes right there. And so, let's do that. So went down to Legislative Council and drafted the amendment to turn the whole Capitol grounds, including where the executive offices were, the fountains and the cherry trees, into a state park, and elevate the entire thing for the people of Oregon. Got back in committee, had a great debate about that. Courtney didn't want to go that far. He wanted to just stay at the Capitol. But we rolled him. And he says right there, well, you're rolling me. We're rolling me. So, okay. So we take the amendment, put that in it. We get Courtney to actually put his name on the bill. So it's Atkinson, me, and Courtney on the bill. And it says, you're going along for this ride, Mr. President. And we take it to the Senate and we pass it pretty easily. But then we had a problem. It went over to the House of Representatives, and the Speaker immediately referred it to the Ways and Means Committee. So I don't know why he said it, the Ways and Means Committee. So that's a sign that something's afoot. So as we're kind of doing our little investigation, we found out there was a lot of opposition to it from various conservation groups that were not testifying publicly or talking publicly, but were going to House members and saying how this was not good to be using park money. It should be for other parks, not for the Capitol, and this would take money away from other conservation projects. Kind of the zero-sum game you mentioned, which we don't want that money going that way. But it was difficult to be publicly saying, I don't think the people have a right to have this as their state park. But they were very effective, and as we were doing our preliminary vote count, going over and talking to representatives, it looked like we may not have the votes. We only had like 28 sure votes. So that was a problem. So I had to come up with a way to make this happen. So we were able to get enough votes by one to get it out of committee and into the floor, but again, wasn't sure we were going to have the votes. In anticipation of this, I went up to Portland to see Bill Dickey. Bill Dickey runs a major printing place that does all Democratic campaign signs. Every time you see a Democratic campaign sign and that type of stuff, it's printed there. Campaign mail you get from Democrats, it came from Bill Dickey's shop, right? I said, Bill, I need a favor. I need 15 lawn signs. And, for Senate Bill 632, your next state capitol park. So he makes them up, and I get those. And so the day before the vote, I go out to the state capitol at 7:30 in the morning. I know everybody's going to show up about 8 o'clock. And I put those lawn signs on the Capitol property around every entrance where I know every legislator and every member of the media and the lobbyists would see them. I knew they wouldn't last long because you're not supposed to do that. I didn't care about that. I just needed a couple of hours. I wanted everybody to see that. And they did. Not to mention, I also called the media, who at that time was pretty robust, and they had their own offices in the Capitol. I said, there's signs on the Capitol in support of 632. You might want to take a look at that. Because I wanted some coverage on the vote was coming up for the Capitol Park. Well, it worked. And that day there was a Capitol Park budget, et cetera. I was on the floor of the Senate about 10 o'clock, and Senator Walker gets up in a remonstrance. Somebody put campaign signs out on the Capitol. This is not appropriate, you know. I'm just kind of sitting there, kind of a little smug, and she looks at me, and she made the connection that was me. And they had gotten taken down at that point, but it had accomplished the task. And we got good coverage on it that day, and the next day we passed it barely, 34, I think, to 26, and it created the state Capitol Park. And about a year later was the dedication, and it was sensational. And so I kept that going. So the next session, 2008, we had the first, what we call mini session now. It was a trial run. Peter wanted to have annual sessions with a short session. We had to convince voters to do that, so he wanted to pilot that to show that we could do that and not get carried away. So in 2008 was the first one. It was about 28 days. He limited every legislator to just 2 bills. And said, we got to make sure that we can do this and not get carried away. So one of the bills I did was, keeping with my Capitol theme, is that we had the Walk of the Flags, all 50 states with flags you can see on the west side of the Capitol. We honored Medal of Honor winners from Oregon. There was a number of memorials on the park. But I said the people that own this land, the 9 recognized federal tribes, you know, they deserved, I thought, recognition on the Capitol grounds. And so I wrote a bill to create a monument in recognition of the 9 federally recognized tribes on the state Capitol grounds. I know I had to have a bill that I could move through quickly. Anything that had any controversy, you'll never get done in three and a half weeks, all the way through the process. There's a lot of love for the tribes and understandings. I thought I could move that through. Interesting, after I introduced the bill and we came on the Senate floor, the Bend Bulletin came out with an editorial, a scathing editorial against my bill, saying, with all the big problems that Oregon is facing, this senator from Welch's is wasting one of his 2 bills on some monument on the state Capitol. I mean, it just ripped me to shreds on it. Obviously, showing their lack of understanding of what it actually takes to pass legislation. We weren't going to solve poverty or housing in 3.5 weeks. But we passed that bill unanimously, the House and Senate. Had a great ceremony there a year and a half later with all the tribes and the governor, and it was absolutely wonderful. And then finally, the next session in 2009, this was another bill that actually started with another senator. This one started with Bruce Starr. It was the 150th anniversary of statehood, and what were we going to do to celebrate that? Well, Bruce came up with the idea that on the 100-year anniversary, school children got together for a new license plate to honor the 100-year and come up with a name, and they came up with Pacific Wonderland. And they created the Pacific Wonderland plate. It was blue with gold lettering. It was very, very popular. And if you were a car collector like I was, people who had vintage cars wanted to get one of those original Pacific Wonderland plates, you know, for their vehicle. So he came up with that idea, well, why don't we create 1,000 plates as commemorative plates? And so we were talking about that bill, and I said, you know, again, let's think bigger. I says, this would be a very popular plate, and it could do some good things. There's been a lot of plates that people have this idea of, but there's no constituency really behind them, and they never put any effort to actually make them work. But I said, this one is going to have a big constituency because people love that license plate. I know all collectors are going to want it, and because of the anniversary, et cetera, and especially if we made it exactly like the original plate. So we just expanded it to thousands and thousands and dedicated the funding to the Oregon Capitol Foundation, which was in its infancy at the time, didn't have any money, figure out what they were going to do. I said, this could be a good way to provide working capital to get them off the ground and actually be meaningful to spread the word of the Capitol to young kids and other adults. Well, I had a little problem because Betsy Johnson, Senator Betsy Johnson at the time, was unhappy with the bill, and I couldn't figure out why, and didn't want it to move forward because it had to be in Ways and Means, and she was in Ways and Means. So I went to talk to Betsy, and it turned out was she had a particular relationship with the Oregon Historical Society, so she didn't like me to do this all just for the foundation. I said, well, we can solve that. Why don't we give half of this to the Historical Society, half to the foundation? Problem solved. She was totally on board. So we were able to move that through the Senate. But then it went to the House, and it was the last 2 days of session. And it was in committee, and it wasn't coming out. Representative Terry Byer was the chair of transportation there. Like me, she hated all this proliferation of all these different license plates that no one ever ended up buying, whatever else. And yet, I convinced her, or I was trying to convince her that this was different. It's the 150th anniversary. It's a retro. It's going to do good things, and it will. We will be able, with the help of the Historical Society and the foundation, to market that and make it a viable moneymaker for two important organizations. But it wasn't moving. On the final day of session, it was still in committee. What's going to happen? So I went over to see Representative Byer at her desk on the floor, basically begged her to let that bill through. And everything had to be a suspension of the rules at that point. To move. The legislature can move fast when it wants to, otherwise it's very slow. And then I went up, I got Betsy Johnson, and we went up to the Speaker Hunt. This bill has to get out of committee, and we have to suspend parliament procedure to advance this bill. He agreed. So about 30 minutes later, the committee met, passed the bill. Goes on to the floor, but it has to be second read, third read. That takes days. We have about an hour and a half left. So convinced the Speaker, and with Senator Johnson's help, asked us to suspend the rules and move to immediate third reading of the bill. And if anybody objects, it doesn't work. Nobody objected. There was 3 budget bills left to pass. They were just going through them like a knife through butter, right? As soon as you go through those budget bills, you go to the sine die resolution. All the other bills on the calendar die. You don't just do them because they're on the calendar. Once you get to sine die resolution, you're done. Mine was on the foot of the calendar, 50 bills down. So suspended the rules, moved it for an immediate order of business, passed the bill, and adjourned 10 minutes later.
Pretty exciting.
Very proud of that.
Yeah.
It just shows you how that process can work. Very difficult. But it's led to a great Capitol Foundation. Been very beneficial to the Historical Society. And the sales of those plates exceeded everything we ever expected. I have the first plate. I insisted on getting the first plate. I was the chair of transportation. I was supposed to go to the governor. Ted had to step aside. I got number 1. Ted got number 2. And another thing that was just interesting historically about this plate, I wanted to be historically accurate. So they had their archives of the original plate when they last start making them, and they ended at 9999 was the last plate they made that they had authorized. So I said, I want this plate to be the exact plate. I want it to pick off exactly where it left off. So for collectors, it would be meaningful. And all the plates, now are laser printed. If you look at them, they're flat laser printed. This plate was a stamp plate. It was embossed and was painted. It wasn't lasered, it was painted. It was 4 coats of paint back in those days. I wanted it exactly that way. And that's what it is. It's an embossed plate with multiple layers of paint on it. So it has that historical significance. And we started out with 9P001, right after the end of the 1959 series of plates. And they've all, there's no custom plates for that. It's all numerical in order to keep the historical significance of that plate.
And you can still get that plate?
Yeah. and people still are. We got a car a year ago, and I got another one of that, and it's great because it's $100. It's a one-time fee, but $100 in addition to the standard, plate fee. And that $100, $50 goes to the foundation, $50 goes to the Oregon Historical Society, and it has produced millions of dollars since that plate was issued, and people are still buying it today.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, you've covered this, I think, already, but there may be things that you want to mention too. We've talked a lot about your accomplishments and some about challenges that you've had during your time in the legislature. Are there others that you?
Well, the legislature is just a challenging place for everyone, and I think that one thing that's really important, I think, for citizens to know is that people work really hard in the legislature. Everybody's really trying to do the right thing. You're pulled a lot of different directions, and you're immersed with hundreds of bills that you can't be an expert on, and yet you're called to make decisions on things. And so I think it's a real tribute to the people who are willing to serve in that capacity, especially in Oregon, where we are, quote, technically a citizen legislator, but that's kind of in name only. If you're in the Senate, you got 200,000 constituents. They think you're their legislator every day, right? And when they need something, they're calling you. So it's a full-time part-time job because there's nothing really part-time about it. Even when you're not in session, you're doing events. You're asked to speak. You're asked to visit and with constituents all year long. So it's a really, really challenging environment. It is one that I think has served Oregon well. I'm very proud of all the people who serve and recognize the sacrifice they made. And if you see the body of the legislature, they come from all different backgrounds, and I think that serves the state well. They come in, they come out. One thing about that, I'll never forget from Peter Courtney. We had term limits, originally when I first came in. Supreme Court ended up overturning those in the early 2000s, but for a few years we operated on term limits, and you could only serve 3 terms of the House and 2 terms, or 2 terms of the Senate, so 6 years or 8, depending, whatever. And there was a lot of concern about when those came in. They came in the mid-1990s. About a brain drain of history of why we do things and how we do things. You need some mentors there to say, well, we've been doing this for 20 years, and let me tell you why we haven't changed or why we need to change or whatever. But there was it was popular back then because, at that time, Newt Gingrich was making the big thing in Congress about we need to have term limits. It was, throw the bums out. So the public had passed this term limit thing. And so we were losing some legislators with a lot of history of how the legislature actually worked. And for young people, like when I came in, not young by age, but young in service, I valued their expertise and their guidance on, why does this bill keep coming back, and help me understand this better. And we were about to lose that. And Peter gave a speech in support when we passed, when we were advocating to get rid of term limits. He gave a speech on the Senate floor that was really remarkable. He went back through until 1930, the history of the Oregon legislature. There's no term limits until recently. And he looked at the turnover in the House and the Senate. And if you looked at it, you found that every 10 to 15 years, the legislature turned over like 95% on its own, without any type of term limits. People term limit themselves out for all kinds of reasons. And I thought that was very compelling. What is interesting, now to prove Peter's point, when the Supreme Court overturned that in 2003, something like that, where they overturned the term limits with no term limits now for the last 20 some years, That has still continued. People term limit themselves out one way or another. I came in the Senate in 1999. Not a single person I served with is in the Senate anymore. Only 2 people in the entire legislature were there when I served, and that was near the end of my service. That's 60 members of the House of Representatives. There's 2 that were there 12 years ago, out of 60. The system works.
Well, then you served for 12 years at the state level, and then you went and served at the national level, at the federal level.
I got a call a few days before Christmas in 2012. I guess people in the East Coast forget that there's 3 hours difference on the West Coast. So like 5 in the morning, I get this call. Like, who's calling me at 5 in the morning? And it was so-and-so from the White House. Oh, yeah. I don't buy anything this early in the morning. Don't bother me. So no, really calling the White House. And we are interested in discussing with you whether you'd be interested in an appointment by the president to the National Credit Administration. I said, well, let's talk. Well, so I got a follow-up call. It should be a few weeks. I'm going to send you some stuff we want you to fill out, and we're going to vet some things, and then we don't know who we're going to select. We're just trying to figure out who to recommend. So about a month later, then I got a call back, and the reason I got the call back is 2 reasons. Well, actually 3 reasons. Troy Stang, who was the president of the Credit Union League, had talked to other leagues around the country, I think, on my behalf, because they were going to be a new board member, and they said, we have somebody here, be pretty good. And obviously that voice then gets to senators on the banking committee too. And then the 2 big ones were Senator Merkley, who actually was the one that first suggested me to the White House. And then the third one was Jim Oleski. Jim Oleski is the professor, a former staffer, now at Lewis and Clark College, School of Law, and worked in our staff when I was in the Senate. Well, Jim had gone on to become legislative director for President Obama in the White House. So when I got this call, I called Jim Oleski. I said, Jim, I got this call to the White House, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what my chances are or what I need to do. And the head of appointments is this lady's name. Oh, I know her well. My office is right next to hers. So I said, would you mind going in and telling her that, I'm not a criminal and I won't embarrass the president and, might be an okay pick. Happy to do that. So he went around the corner and said, I think he'd be a good pick. A week later, I got a call, said, can you be in D.C. in 2 days? We'd like to conduct an interview. So flew to D.C., went to the executive office building, had 3 or 4 folks there interview me. And then about 3 days later, I got a call and said, President wants to appoint you. So then I went through that whole process. How do you get confirmed by the Senate and all that? So, I'm just going to get grilled by Elizabeth Warren and Senator Schumer and everybody on that committee. And so I had to do all this prep. It was an amazing experience. But we got through the Senate, got confirmed. And so I served 6 years. You had a set term. Things seem to be a little different nowadays in Washington, but a set term that it was an independent regulator, financial regulator, the FDIC, the SEC, the Federal Reserve, and the NCUA. The financial regulators were semi-independent agencies. And so you had a fixed term, and I had a fixed term for 6 years. And Obama left the White House, and Donald Trump was elected. And I'd been chairman of the agency, and Donald Trump was elected, and I still 2.5 years left of my term. And I served. So I served in both the Obama and the first Trump administration. In fact, I think I was told I was the longest carryover of any of the members of Democrats in that. Maybe he just didn't know. I don't know if President Trump had ever been in a credit, so maybe he just, But I went through and I served 2.5 years under Trump as well as the 3.5 years under Obama.
Had you already decided that you were going to leave the Senate before this phone call
Yes.
came?
Yeah. I had already left. It was about a year in between.
Okay.
And so I had gone back and actually started my public affairs committee again, a business again. I was just starting that up when that happened. So there was about a year in between.
So then you had this public affairs company you were starting. Then you have this 6-year serving
Yeah.
at the federal level. And then after that, you come back here and end up working for a former legislative aide.
Yeah. So I came back, and then within a few months, COVID hit of my return from Washington. So we were all of us were locked down for like a year, right? And so, I was retiring, and I guess I'm being retired anyway by COVID. But I think, like a lot of people, that was a tough year in a lot of ways. I mean, you just shut out from society. You're so busy in being active and, things you have to do all the time, and being into the fire of stuff, and then all of a sudden there's nothing. And I'm not a guy who can sit on the porch. I just, I can't do that. So I went to work. Ryan called me. I had touched base with him a number of times because he's a former staffer, and we remained close over the years. So he had taken over this firm, PacWest, and that he had worked for a long time since he left me, but then he ended up buying out the previous owner and running the company. And he says, I've got a few young people, and I need maybe some senior leadership. Can you help me? And I said, well, I'd like to do some things. I said, I'm not going to be a full-time lobbyist. I'm not going to put my butt down in that lobby all day long with those people. I can't do that. But I always appreciate mentorship, and I wouldn't mind helping you out, mentoring them, giving some ideas, kind of working behind the scenes. And then if it's an issue I really care about, I'd be happy to advocate for that as long as I can select what I do. He said, done deal. So I'd spent 3.5 years. And I'm their legislative director, and I work with some great folks, and mostly do writing, research, and a lot of public affairs. I do my media work, so issues that are really important, I work with the print and the TV media to see that when you watch the story on Channel 8, maybe my issues are going to be covered. So I try to move the agenda a lot through the media. And just like I did before, give public attention to things I think need public attention. Did 2 years ago, financial literacy is my issue. I tried to do that when I was in high school. I tried to do that 20 years ago. We never could get across the finish line. I lobbied on that on behalf of Oregon State Credit Union. And I said, but it's always failed at the end. There's a lot of opposition from people, especially the education community, who just don't want any more things in schools. But I felt that was one of the most important things that every child needs is financial education. And the data is so clear about how that changes your ability to succeed as an adult. And so, while I was lobbying that in the legislature, 80% of the work I did was raising public awareness and support editorials, things that really could help move that needle. And I do that a lot. So I kind of work behind the scenes there, and then occasionally, testify in the legislature and kind of keep a little fresh there.
It's quite beautiful how full circle all of your different career paths have come together for what you're doing now.
And I think a lot of people in their own career would say the same thing. You learn from every one of them, and they all really they were all intertwined. They come together. You use what you learn doing one thing and transpose that to something else. And as I said early on, everybody is an advocate. Whether everybody's a lobbyist, for example. We are all advocating, lobbying for something we want and convincing someone else to grab their hand and take them where they are and bring them in your side of the room. And that's the way in sports. That's the way it is in business. That's the way it is when you're a legislator, and that's when you're a citizen or a lobbyist. It's the same thing as making a case why we need to move a certain direction, and they all kind of complement each other.
The last question I had was just understanding a little bit about your work as a historian. You took me around part of your home and showed me some of the pieces that you have. I mean, behind you there's Ted Kennedy and Robert Kennedy.
I started doing that when I was in high school. In fact, the signed photograph I have of Ted Kennedy was he's a United States Senator, and I was in high school visiting back in Washington, D.C. I had this, studio photograph I got from his office, and I ran into him and I asked him to sign it. And I waited until he came out to leave in the hallway and got him to sign that. I've always loved history. It goes back to when my dad was postmaster, and I started collecting stamps because they were all about something. I had to research each stamp. What was this all about? So I started collecting historical documents, American history primarily, and it kind of brings history to life when you read about people, but then you actually see their handwriting or something they had. It just really brought that to life for me, and I've always loved U.S. history. And then in the last 20 years, I started collecting a lot of Oregon history. So Joseph Lane, the founders of Oregon. I have a letter signed by Joseph Lane. Some of the earliest senators in Oregon, 1870s, 1880s, have letters and autographs of those folks on various documents. One of the things I found that was fascinating along that was that they had the fire that burned the Capitol down in the 1930s, and they lost a lot of stuff. You may have read that, the Capitol's been searching for some of the portraits of some of the governors that were missing, that were destroyed in the fire, that there may be other ones, and they've been trying to put that together. Well, if you go in the Senate, in the back of the Senate, in the Secretary of the Senate's office, there's these large frame, black and white portraits of the Senate for each year. And all the senators would be posed, and they still do that now. But back then they were old black and whites. And I noticed that they didn't have them all either. There were certain years missing. And so about 15 years ago, I was doing, the Antiques Roadshow, so to speak. Like a lot of people, I'd go to garage sales, right? And I would see something back when they had newspapers, and that's how you found stuff out, that there was a garage sale in Albany. And it was somebody who had been in politics and, a lot of old political stuff. Oh, that sounds interesting. So I went down there, and there were two Oregon State Senate, 1917, 1923, and they were missing. And there they were. So, $10, I bought them. And then a few years ago, I donated them to the Senate so they could have those back. But it's always nice to find those little treasures, and collected a lot of things from Mark Hatfield and Governor McCall. In fact, one of the other license plates I have that I also found years ago was Gov 7, and it was the blue plate with the yellow. It was one of McCall's plates for his governor's entourage. It was from the Governor McCall era, and I got that one too. So I just love that. It brings things that you hear about to life, and I think that's important. Just like the foundation, just like the Historical Society, it brings it to life.
Totally. Well, those are the questions I had. Is there anything that you wanted to make sure we talked about?
Oh boy, I think I've talked about everything, haven't I? I'd say the only thing is that despite all the turmoil in the country, and we think about the divisions in Oregon, I think our government still functions well. It has its hiccups, but we also, I think one thing that's with everything that's happening, it reminds us we have to be mindful that it just doesn't happen. And people have to support through citizen engagement the democracy. Everybody has to be a part of this at whatever level, whether it's school board, whether it's a member of the legislature, whether it's a citizen advocate for children or for seniors or every other cause to engage. And that's what makes our system work. And I think overall that still works well in Oregon. We can always do better, but everybody's voice makes a difference. And if you remember that, and history has proven that, and then you engage in it, and our democracy will continue to thrive.
Great, thank you.